Spring of 1985. The Central Intelligence Agency's Soviet East European Division is monitoring the absolute pinnacle of their covert networks inside the USSR. Suddenly, one by one, the communication lines go entirely dead. We're not talking about low-level informants or political dissidents. We are talking about generals in the GRU, senior officers in the KGB, and top-tier technical assets who had spent decades feeding the Pentagon's Soviet military engineering secrets. The silence is absolute. It is the single most significant intelligence hemorrhage in American history. And the cause of this unprecedented operational collapse was not a brilliant Soviet technical breach. It was a man named Aldrich Ames. Ames was not a master of tradecraft. He was a notoriously lazy, mid-level counterintelligence analyst with a severe drinking problem who simply decided one afternoon to walk straight into the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C. with a plastic bag full of classified identities. Understanding how a mediocre bureaucrat managed to blind the most heavily funded intelligence apparatus on the planet requires looking past the Hollywood myths of espionage and examining the brutal realities of institutional blindness. If you want to unpack the actual mechanics of declassified history and understand the engineering and bureaucratic systems that define the Cold War, consider joining us and subscribing. We examine the exact points where official narratives break down and the raw evidence takes over. Let us establish the baseline of the operational environment. In the mid-1980s, the Central Intelligence Agency had painstakingly built a network of deep cover assets embedded deep within the Soviet military-industrial complex. These individuals provided critical schematics on advanced hardware, from Soviet early warning radar networks to the aerodynamic specifications of advanced fighters like the MiG-29. Then, starting in the late summer and fall of 1985, an invisible scythe sweeps through the network. Handlers in Moscow show up to routine dead drops, only to find nothing. Emergency communication signals go unacknowledged. High-ranking assets simply fail to report for duty and vanish from their official posts. At Langley, the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency, the initial reaction is confusion, which rapidly accelerates into institutional panic. You must understand the stakes here. Losing one asset is an operational setback. Losing two in a month is a crisis. Losing virtually the entire Soviet stable in a matter of weeks represents an impossibility. The sheer velocity of the losses told the analysts at Langley they were dealing with something completely outside the bounds of normal counter-espionage attrition, but the direction they chose to look would cost them another 9 years of strategic failure. Langley immediately locked down its Soviet division. They formed highly compartmented secret task forces. The initial operating theories developed by the agency's senior directors leaned heavily into the technical domain. Was there a microscopic acoustic anomaly hidden in the typewriters at the Moscow embassy? Had Soviet engineers compromised the encrypted telecommunications cables routing through Europe? The counterintelligence chiefs possessed an institutional arrogance that demanded a highly sophisticated explanation for their losses. They genuinely believed that only a masterstroke of Soviet engineering, or a highly elaborate technical deception campaign, could dismantle their networks so thoroughly and so fast. The reality was sitting at a desk right down the hall. Aldrich Ames was, by all declassified performance reviews, an incredibly unremarkable employee. He had joined the agency in 1962, largely because his father had worked there. For over 2 decades, he floated through various overseas assignments in Ankara, New York, and Mexico City, leaving behind a permanent trail of mediocre evaluations, missed operational deadlines, and security infractions related to his heavy alcohol consumption. He was known to sleep at his desk. He occasionally left highly classified dossiers on the subway. Yet, in 1983, through the sheer momentum of bureaucratic inertia and a lack of available personnel, Ames was promoted to the counterintelligence branch of the Soviet East European Division. Placing a struggling, disgruntled employee at the apex of the agency's most sensitive compartment was a structural failure of immense proportions. As the branch chief, Ames was given direct, unfettered access to the true names of virtually every active American asset operating behind the Iron Curtain. He did not have to hack into a mainframe or pick a safe. The paper files were routinely delivered directly to his office. In 1985, Ames finalized a messy, highly expensive divorce. His financial situation was dire. His solution was purely mercenary. He did not possess a deeply rooted ideological sympathy for the Soviet Union. He simply wanted cash. And once the KGB started paying him, The red flags Ames generated were so intensely glaring that they almost looped back around to becoming invisible to his superiors. Consider the financial timeline. A mid-level government employee earning roughly $60,000 a year suddenly purchases a house in Arlington, Virginia. The price tag is $540,000. He pays for it entirely in cash. He does not take out a mortgage. He simply writes a check. It does not stop there. The parking lot at Langley was typically filled with modest, sensible sedans driven by government workers. Ames starts pulling into his designated parking spot in a brand new $50,000 white Jaguar. He walks the halls of the Central Intelligence Agency wearing a Rolex watch. He wears tailor-made Italian suits that cost more than his monthly take-home pay. He racks up credit card bills of over $30,000 a month. He even drops tens of thousands of dollars to completely rebuild his teeth with premium dental caps. He is practically broadcasting his sudden influx of wealth to a building full of trained investigators. How does an intelligence agency, whose sole purpose is to detect anomalies, fail to notice a mediocre analyst flaunting immense unexplained wealth while its Soviet networks are actively disintegrating? The answer lies in the culture of the institution itself. The agency in the 1980s operated much like an elite, closed fraternity. There was a prevailing unspoken assumption that true treason, the kind that resulted in the complete neutralization of high-level assets, was a foreign concept. An officer might struggle with operational protocols, but they simply did not sell out their colleagues for a luxury sports car. This cultural blind spot was so pervasive that when colleagues did finally ask Ames about his sudden financial windfall, his excuse was accepted with virtually zero pushback. Ames simply claimed that his new wife came from a wealthy Colombian family. That was the entirety of his cover story. No one in the Office of Security ran a basic financial background check on her family's actual corporate holdings. No one audited his bank accounts to trace the origin of the wire transfers. The agency was so rigidly compartmentalized and so fundamentally biased toward trusting its own personnel that investigators spent thousands of hours and millions of dollars tearing apart the walls of the Moscow embassy looking for non-existent listening devices, while Ames drove his Jaguar home to Arlington. Adding to the institutional paralysis was the profound failure of the polygraph system. During this 9-year period of active espionage, Ames was subjected to routine security polygraphs. He passed them. The machine failed to detect his deception because polygraphs fundamentally measure physiological stress responses, not objective truth. Ames felt absolutely no guilt or anxiety about his actions. His sheer arrogance, combined with the incredibly narrow scope of the examiner's questions, allowed him to casually bypass the agency's primary internal security tripwire. The paradox of Aldrich Ames is that his survival depended entirely on his lack of sophistication. He did not use elaborate encryption algorithms. He did not conduct complex surveillance detection routes through the streets of Washington. He operated with a brazen sloppiness that completely short-circuited the advanced threat matrices developed by American counterintelligence. He hid in plain sight, protected by the very institution he was actively dismantling. But while Langley was blinding itself with internal politics and chasing technical phantoms, over in Moscow, the KGB handlers receiving Ames's intelligence were facing a highly complex operational dilemma of their own. When an American intelligence officer hands you a massive, unredacted directory of your own compromised personnel in exchange for literal bags of cash, you do not just silently remove the assets. You have to figure out how to systematically eliminate the compromised networks without tipping off the Americans that their operations are fundamentally broken from the inside. The Soviets had to build a diversion, and the scale of the deception they engineered to protect their new, highly lucrative asset would completely rewrite the rules of counterintelligence. Operating inside the Soviet embassy in Washington, D.C., the Line K-R desk was responsible for counterintelligence. The officers staffing this desk were highly trained operators accustomed to the intricate psychological dance of espionage. Historically, when an American intelligence officer made the dangerous decision to cross the ideological divide, the initial contact was tentative. It was usually fraught with anxiety, philosophical justifications, and complex demands for operational security. Then came June 13th, 1985, when Aldrich Ames walked in and initiated what would later be known in intelligence circles as the Big Dump. Soviet handlers were completely astounded by the sheer, blunt transaction of the event. Ames did not offer a complex philosophical rationale for betraying his country. He did not ask for elaborate exfiltration plans or specialized communications hardware. He simply handed over massive plastic bags stuffed with between 5 and 7 pounds of raw, unredacted Central Intelligence Agency printouts. Inside those bags were the true names of virtually every high-value human asset operating on behalf of the United States inside the Soviet Union. In exchange, Ames demanded straight cash. Look closely at the operational dilemma facing the Committee for State Security, or the KGB, in Moscow when these files arrived on the desk of the first Chief Directorate. The intelligence windfall was so comprehensive and delivered with such brazen sloppiness that senior Soviet counterintelligence chiefs initially suspected a trap. The material included the operational dossiers of men like Adolf Tolkachev, a brilliant Soviet aviation electronics engineer. Tolkachev had been systematically handing the Americans the highly classified circuitry layouts for the look-down, shoot-down radar systems utilized in advanced Soviet interceptors. His intelligence directly allowed American defense contractors to program the electronic warfare and countermeasures suites on tactical fighters like the F-15 Eagle. By handing over Tolkachev and dozens of others, Ames was not just neutralizing individual informants. He was erasing a decade of American tactical air superiority planning and strategic nuclear oversight in a single afternoon. Once KGB analysts verified the authenticity of the documents, the sheer scale of the information forced a massive shift in Soviet strategy. The primary directive was no longer simply to exploit the compromised assets, but to actively protect the man providing the files. The KGB faced a delicate sequencing problem. If they simply swept up every compromised American asset overnight, Langley would immediately recognize that their internal personnel directories had been breached by a high-level mole. To mask the hemorrhage, Soviet security forces attempted to orchestrate a series of fabricated operational failures. They manufactured routine traffic stops, staged accidental security breaches, and initiated bogus internal audits to make it appear as though the American assets were being caught by conventional Soviet police work. But the KGB leadership ultimately lacked the patience to let this slow-roll deception play out. The temptation to eradicate the American spy network was too great. The KGB accelerated the timeline, systematically arresting and neutralizing the assets in rapid succession. This velocity was the exact trigger that sent Langley into an institutional panic, sparking one of the most intense internal debates in the history of American counterintelligence. How did this happen? And more importantly, how did Ames continue to sell highly classified files for another 8 years, while his own agency actively hunted the leak? The answer is buried in the declassified post-mortem reports generated by the Inspector General of the Central Intelligence Agency years later. These documents meticulously outline a catastrophic, systemic, institutional failure defined by bureaucratic stovepiping and a dangerous over-reliance on flawed security protocols. The agency was structurally divided. The Soviet East European Division handled the operational tradecraft and ran the spies. The Office of Security was an entirely separate entity responsible for internal personnel background checks, building access, and polygraph examinations. These two departments rarely shared actionable intelligence regarding their own personnel. Consider the administrative reality of this compartmentalization. The Office of Security was well aware of Ames and his sudden, massive influx of wealth. But because they operated in a vacuum, divorced from the operational crisis unfolding in the Soviet division, they processed his financial anomalies as administrative trivia rather than counterintelligence red flags. The postmortem reviews revealed that internal investigators fundamentally lacked a financial auditing mandate. The Privacy Act of 1974 had created a deep-seated cultural and legal hesitancy within the government to demand access to an employee's private bank accounts without a formal criminal predicate. Because senior leadership refused to believe a mole existed, they never established that predicate. When Ames casually attributed his wealth to his wife's Colombian family, the Office of Security simply wrote it down and closed the file. No one cross-referenced the corporate holdings. No one traced the KGB wire transfers routing through European banks. This administrative blindness was compounded by the devastating failure of the agency's primary security tripwire. Declassified records show that the Office of Security routinely passed Ames on his mandatory polygraph examinations, even when the machine registered highly deceptive responses regarding his foreign contacts. The polygraph is not a magic window into the human soul. It is a machine that measures physiological stress indicators like heart rate, blood pressure, and galvanic skin response. Because Ames felt absolutely no ideological guilt or moral anxiety about his mercenary actions, his baseline stress levels remained remarkably low. Furthermore, the structure of the polygraph examination itself provided a massive procedural loophole. Ames was subjected to a counterintelligence scope polygraph, which specifically asks whether the subject has engaged in unauthorized contact with foreign intelligence officers. But Ames was a senior Soviet branch chief. His actual job description required him to regularly interact with Soviet embassy officials to assess them for potential recruitment. Whenever the polygraph examiner noted a physiological spike during questions about Soviet contacts, Ames simply explained that he was thinking about his officially sanctioned meetings. The examiner, lacking the operational context to challenge him, accepted the explanation and cleared him for continued access to the nation's most sensitive secrets. While the Office of Security failed on a procedural level, the leadership of the counterintelligence task force at Langley failed on an analytical one. As the Soviet networks evaporated, the task force became deeply fractured over the origin of the losses. One faction, anchored by a few skeptical analysts, began to quietly whisper the terrifying possibility of an internal human compromise. But the dominant faction, led by senior agency executives, aggressively pushed the theory of a catastrophic technical breach. This was a psychological defense mechanism as much as an analytical theory. It was far easier for the elite leadership of the agency to believe that Soviet engineers had developed a microscopic, undetectable acoustic vulnerability inside the American embassy in Moscow than to accept that one of their own colleagues was selling them out for a pile of cash. The agency poured millions of dollars and thousands of man-hours into tearing apart the telecommunications architecture in Europe, desperately searching for a phantom KGB intercept cable that did not exist. Then, a crucial historical anomaly provided the agency with exactly what it wanted. In the fall of 1985, a disgruntled former Central Intelligence Agency trainee named Edward Lee Howard defected to the Soviet Union. Howard had possessed limited knowledge of some operational procedures in Moscow before he was fired. The counterintelligence chiefs at Langley immediately seized upon Howard's defection. They constructed a highly convenient operational narrative, officially concluding that Howard alone was responsible for the cascading asset losses. This false assumption became official doctrine. It allowed the agency to externalize the blame, effectively closing the book on the internal search for a mole. It was this specific, catastrophic analytical failure that granted Aldrich Ames nearly a decade of unchallenged access to the agency's most guarded vaults. But over in Moscow, KGB counterintelligence planners knew that the Edward Lee Howard narrative would not hold up forever. The intelligence Ames was providing was simply too broad, and the timeline of the compromised assets did not perfectly align with what Howard actually knew. The Soviets realized that if the Americans ever bothered to rigorously audit the specific files that had been compromised against the access logs at Langley, the mathematical overlap would point directly at a single desk. To ensure their greatest asset remained entirely invisible, Soviet intelligence would have to construct a diversionary masterpiece so convincing that it would keep the Americans chasing shadows for years. The first chief directorate of the Committee for State Security, operating out of their headquarters in Yasenevo, faced a highly complex operational paradox. They possessed the greatest intelligence asset in the history of the Cold War, but the sheer volume of his production threatened to expose him. Relying on the defection of a disgruntled former trainee to explain away the systemic collapse of every major American network in the Soviet Union was a tactical stopgap, not a long-term strategy. Soviet counterintelligence planners knew that the operational access of their scapegoat was geographically and chronologically limited. If American analysts ever stopped panicking long enough to run a strict mathematical regression on the compromised files, they would realize the defected trainee simply did not have the security clearance to access the European dossiers that were actively being neutralized. A massive statistical anomaly was ticking like a time bomb inside the vaults at Langley. To ensure their asset remained entirely invisible, Soviet intelligence activated a sprawling, highly sophisticated doctrine known as Mascarovka. This was not a simple cover story. Mascarovka is a comprehensive system of military and strategic deception designed to manipulate an adversary's decision-making matrix by feeding them exactly what they are already predisposed to believe. The KGB understood the institutional arrogance of the Central Intelligence Agency. They knew the American counterintelligence chiefs desperately wanted to believe their operational failures were the result of a brilliant technical breach rather than human corruption. The Soviet planners weaponized this assumption flawlessly. They began systematically planting fabricated technical vulnerabilities into the intelligence ecosystem. They intentionally leaked carefully constructed rumors through third-party diplomatic channels, suggesting that the acoustic architecture of the newly constructed American embassy in Moscow had been fundamentally compromised during its initial concrete pours. They hinted that microscopic transmitters were embedded in the steel girders, capturing the keystrokes of American typewriters through ambient vibration analysis. The reaction at the Central Intelligence Agency was exactly as the KGB had modeled. The agency plunged into a state of technical obsession. They dispatched highly specialized teams of engineers to Moscow. They utilized advanced nonlinear junction detectors to sweep the embassy walls, searching for the harmonic frequencies emitted by hidden semiconductor junctions. They deployed ground-penetrating radar across the floors and utilized industrial X-ray emitters on the concrete columns, desperately hunting for microscopic KGB intercept nodes that simply did not exist. Millions of dollars and thousands of investigative hours were completely swallowed by this fabricated technical phantom. The entire institution was looking at the walls of a building in Moscow, while the actual leak sat comfortably at a desk in Virginia. But technical deception alone was not enough to sustain the illusion indefinitely. The Soviets needed human corroboration to cement the narrative. To achieve this, the KGB deployed one of their most highly trained operators, a man named Alexander Zhomov. When Zhomov intentionally approached American intelligence officers, he was given the operational code name GT Prologue. He initiated a high-stakes psychological operation, offering to sell the Americans the highly classified secret of exactly how their deep cover networks had been dismantled. GT Prologue fed Langley a meticulously crafted lie that perfectly absolved the agency's internal security apparatus. He claimed he was a disgruntled KGB officer with direct access to the secret investigative files regarding the neutralized American spies. He told his American handlers that there was no high-level mole inside their headquarters. Instead, he claimed the American assets were caught through a combination of brilliant Soviet physical surveillance and catastrophic American tradecraft errors. Specifically, GT Prologue capitalized on a very real, very intense American paranoia regarding chemical tracking. During this period, the KGB occasionally utilized an invisible tracking chemical known as nitrophenylpentadienyl, or NPPD, which the Americans referred to as spy dust. Soviet agents would covertly apply this colorless, odorless powder to the steering wheels, door handles, and floor mats of vehicles used by known American intelligence officers in Moscow. The chemical would transfer to the officers' hands and clothing. Later, Soviet counterintelligence could sweep a suspected meeting location or a dead drop site with specialized ultraviolet equipment to detect the residual chemical signature, proving an American handler had been there. GT Prologue convinced the Central Intelligence Agency that this precise chemical methodology, combined with microscopic, concealed surveillance cameras, was responsible for the cascading asset losses of 1985. The analysts at Langley swallowed this fabricated narrative entirely. It provided a mathematically clean, highly technical explanation that completely validated their existing biases. It proved that Soviet counterintelligence was simply outworking them on the streets, allowing the agency's leadership to officially close the book on the internal search for a traitor. While the agency chased these planted chemical traces and tore apart their own diplomatic infrastructure, Aldrich Ames was operating with absolute impunity. The bureaucratic blindness protecting him eventually escalated into a structural absurdity. In 1989, following a relatively quiet overseas assignment in Rome, Ames was rotated back to headquarters. In a decision that highlights the profound compartmentalization of the era, he was assigned directly to the CIA Counterintelligence Center. Consider the operational reality of this promotion. The man responsible for the single most catastrophic intelligence hemorrhage in American history was placed on the very task force explicitly mandated to analyze the fallout of that exact hemorrhage. He was literally assigned to hunt himself. This position granted Ames unrestricted access to the internal progress reports of the Counterintelligence Division. He could read the raw assessments detailing exactly which Soviet phantoms his colleagues were chasing. He reviewed the files on GT Prologue. He understood precisely where the agency's blind spots were located, and he fed this institutional feedback loop directly back to his handlers, allowing the KGB to fine-tune their deception campaign in real time. Meanwhile, the financial logistics of the operation were evolving. In the early days of 1985, Ames had demanded straight cash, hauling pounds of currency out of clandestine meetings in simple shopping bags. But as the intelligence windfall expanded, the KGB recognized that physical cash handoffs were becoming an extreme operational liability. They transitioned Ames to a sophisticated covert financial architecture. Soviet handlers established secure routing numbers and opened clandestine accounts at Credit Suisse in Zurich, Switzerland. The KGB managed the ledgers internally, acting as a highly classified escrow service for their most valuable asset. During a covert meeting, rather than handing him a bag of physical currency, a Soviet handler presented Ames with a printed financial statement. The photograph of this ledger, verified by KGB command, showed over $2 million held securely in his name in Moscow, awaiting his future retirement. Through this mechanism, an unremarkable, heavily indebted mid-level analyst became the highest paid human asset in the history of the Soviet Union. But a deception campaign of this magnitude, operating across multiple continents and involving highly complex financial routing, inevitably generates its own bureaucratic friction. Inside Langley, a small, highly isolated faction of veteran investigators refused to accept the official doctrine. Analysts like Jean Verdefeuille and Sandra Grimes began quietly running independent mathematical regressions on the compromised files. When they cross-referenced the actual operational deployment dates of their neutralized assets against the fabricated timeline provided by GT Prologue, the matrix collapsed. The pieces of the Soviet narrative simply did not fit together. This localized realization created a massive jurisdictional crisis. The internal CIA task force strongly suspected they had an active breach, and the financial anomalies surrounding Ames were finally beginning to surface in highly compartmented internal reviews. But the agency's operational mandate stopped at the American border. The Central Intelligence Agency fundamentally lacked the statutory authority to conduct domestic financial wiretaps, audit private bank accounts, or execute physical surveillance on an American citizen operating on domestic soil. To pierce the veil of Ames's finances, they needed the domestic legal machinery of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. But interdepartmental rivalry during this era was exceptionally fierce. Langley was institutionally terrified of admitting to the Bureau that their elite, highly compartmented Soviet division had been thoroughly compromised by one of their own branch chiefs. The internal smokescreen had paralyzed the investigation for years, and the CIA was highly reluctant to hand over control of their most sensitive counterintelligence failure. The stalemate required a catalyst. Investigators needed a piece of evidence so undeniable and so entirely disconnected from the tangled web of KGB-planted rumors that it would force the agency's executive leadership to bypass their own internal politics. They needed to stop looking at the operational files and start looking at the money. What specific bureaucratic anomaly finally shattered the institutional blockade, forcing a skeptical FBI to unleash its domestic surveillance architecture against an active intelligence officer who knew exactly how the system worked? The bureaucratic stalemate that had paralyzed the search for a mole finally shattered, not through a brilliant feat of counterespionage, but through a routine administrative audit. The internal investigators at Langley were blocked from subpoenaing private domestic bank accounts, but they possessed absolute authority over their own internal travel vouchers. By late 1992, the small faction of skeptical analysts, who had spent years quietly mapping the anomalies surrounding the compromised operational files, decided to run a completely different kind of matrix. They stopped looking at the neutralized networks in Eastern Europe, and they started looking at the airport flight manifests of their own colleagues. When analysts cross-referenced the officially sanctioned travel dates of the counterintelligence branch against publicly available property tax records and credit inquiries, a highly specific pattern emerged. Over the course of several years, Aldrich Ames had utilized his position to authorize routine official trips to locations like Bogota, Colombia, and Caracas, Venezuela. His stated operational objective was usually to assess regional assets or coordinate with allied intelligence services, but the timeline of his return flights revealed a massive, undeniable anomaly. Within 48 hours of returning to American soil from these officially sanctioned trips, Ames would routinely walk into various branches of Dominion Bank in Virginia and initiate massive cash deposits. We're not talking about a few $100s of leftover travel per diem. We are talking about deposits of $20,000, $40,000, and sometimes $90,000 at a time. He frequently attempted to circumvent the Bank Secrecy Act of 1970, which required financial institutions to report currency transactions over $10,000 by breaking the deposits into smaller increments. This practice, known in financial forensics as smurfing, is a basic indicator of illicit cash structuring. But Ames was notoriously lazy. He often grew tired of the administrative hassle of visiting multiple bank branches and simply dumped massive sums of physical currency straight into his primary checking account, practically daring the system to notice him. The chronological overlap was absolute. The dates of his official travel perfectly mirrored the influx of hundreds of thousands of dollars. This single, undeniable piece of structural evidence was the catalyst required to break the jurisdictional blockade. The Central Intelligence Agency could no longer attribute the losses to phantom KGB listening devices in Moscow. They possessed the formal criminal predicate necessary to approach the Department of Justice. In early 1993, the FBI was formally briefed. The domestic intelligence apparatus was unleashed, and a highly classified joint task force, eventually operating under the codename Night Mover, was established. Put yourself in the position of the FBI tactical coordinators assigned to this task force. You are tasked with executing comprehensive physical and electronic surveillance on an active, highly trained American intelligence officer. This target knows the precise operational capabilities of your surveillance teams. He knows how to detect vehicular tailing. He knows the standard operating procedures for domestic wiretaps. To catch him, the FBI had to deploy the Special Surveillance Group, a highly elite unit composed of operatives who specialize in remaining entirely invisible on domestic soil. The FBI teams deployed a technique known as a rolling box. Rather than utilizing a single vehicle to follow his Jaguar through the streets of Arlington, a sprawling, constantly rotating perimeter of unmarked surveillance vehicles effectively boxed him in from several blocks away. They handed off visual control at intersections, ensuring that the same vehicle never appeared in his rearview mirror twice. They monitored his route to Langley every single morning, but geopolitical realities were rapidly shifting the operational landscape. By the early 1990s, the Soviet Union had officially collapsed. The Iron Curtain was dismantled. The KGB was formally dissolved and restructured into the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service, or SVR. But the espionage did not stop. Ames simply transitioned his allegiances to the new Russian Federation, negotiating directly with SVR handlers to maintain his lucrative operational tempo. The physical tradecraft Ames utilized to communicate with these new handlers was incredibly rudimentary, completely relying on the assumption that no one was watching him. He did not use burst transmitters or encrypted satellite relays. He used pieces of chalk. Through painstaking physical surveillance, the FBI documented Ames establishing a signal site at the corner of 37th and R Streets Northwest in Washington, D.C. There was a standard blue postal relay box situated on the corner. Early in the morning, Ames would casually walk past this mailbox and use a piece of ordinary white chalk to draw a single horizontal line across the side. This simple chalk mark was an operational trigger. It signaled to a Russian diplomat driving past the intersection later that afternoon that a dead drop was loaded and ready for retrieval. The FBI tactical teams quietly installed concealed miniature pinhole cameras inside a parked, heavily modified vehicle facing the intersection. They captured undeniable optical evidence of Ames marking the box. They tracked him from the signal site directly to the dead drops, watching as he deposited classified materials in highly concealed locations, such as under a specific footbridge in a local park, awaiting Russian retrieval. The physical evidence was mounting, but the Night Mover task force needed absolute confirmation of the structural damage. They needed to know exactly what highly classified documents he was currently passing to the SVR, and more importantly, they needed the internal financial ledgers. To get this, the FBI had to authorize one of the most operationally complex maneuvers in domestic counterintelligence. They had to execute a covert black bag job on his residence. In the late summer of 1993, while Ames and his family were away, a specialized FBI covert entry team bypassed the security perimeter of his Arlington home. This was not a standard search warrant execution. The team had to enter the premises, extract the required intelligence, and exit without leaving a single microscopic trace of their presence. If Ames returned and noticed a misaligned door frame, a moved chair, or a tampered lock, he would instantly realize the domestic surveillance net had closed around him, and he would flee. Inside the home, the technical forensic technicians moved directly to his personal computer. Ames utilized a standard, commercially available laptop to draft his communications to his handlers. He possessed enough basic operational awareness to routinely delete his digital files after printing them. But he fundamentally misunderstood the engineering architecture of early 90s magnetic hard drives. When you delete a file on these systems, the computer does not erase the actual data. It simply unallocates the space, removing the file pathway from the operating system's index, so the drive knows that specific sector is available to be overwritten. The FBI forensic technicians imaged the raw hexadecimal data directly off the magnetic platters. Back at the laboratory, analysts painstakingly reconstructed the unallocated sectors. What they extracted from the deleted digital fragments was staggering. They recovered the original drafts of his demand letters to the SVR. They reconstructed detailed operational payout schedules. The letters revealed a deeply arrogant, highly mercenary analyst aggressively complaining to his Russian handlers about exchange rates and demanding larger, more frequent cash deliveries. The digital ledgers confirmed the absolute totality of the financial compromise. Between the physical cash he had already received and the clandestine accounts held securely in European banks, the task force calculated that Ames had earned over $4 million by systematically selling out American operational supremacy. The joint CIA and FBI task force now possessed the travel logs, the bank records, the optical surveillance of the chalk marks, and the reconstructed digital confessions. The investigative matrix was complete, but as the senior directors reviewed the operational timeline to plan the arrest, they encountered a massive immediate logistical crisis that threatened to completely unravel the entire operation. According to the official deployment schedules heavily restricted within the personnel vaults at Langley, Ames was not slated to remain at a desk in Virginia for much longer. He was officially scheduled to travel to Moscow in early 1994 as part of an international CIA conference on counter-narcotics intelligence sharing. Look closely at the tactical nightmare this schedule generated for the FBI. They had successfully built an airtight investigative file on the most damaging mole in American history. But if they allowed Ames to board a transatlantic flight and set foot on Russian soil, the SVR would instantly recognize the vulnerability. The moment he stepped off the plane in Moscow, Russian security forces could simply pull him aside, grant him immediate political asylum, and extract every remaining piece of classified knowledge residing in his memory. The Night Mover Task Force could not allow him to leave the country under any circumstances. But they also could not pull his security clearance or suddenly cancel his travel orders without triggering the highly tuned paranoia of a seasoned intelligence officer. If Ames sensed that his administrative access was being restricted, he would recognize the impending trap, trigger an emergency exfiltration protocol, and attempt to disappear into a foreign embassy before the FBI could secure an indictment. How do you permanently close the trap on a man who has spent his entire career studying exactly how those traps are built, without giving him the single operational millimeter he needs to escape? The operational timeline facing the domestic surveillance task force had compressed into a matter of days. Aldrich Ames was officially scheduled to board a transatlantic flight to Moscow on February 22, 1994. The Federal Bureau of Investigation knew with absolute certainty that if he stepped off a plane onto Russian soil, the Foreign Intelligence Service would immediately pull him behind a diplomatic shield, secure his defection, and extract every remaining operational secret in his possession. The domestic net had to close, and it had to close without triggering the highly tuned paranoia of a seasoned counterintelligence officer. The tactical coordinators discarded any complex plans for a controlled sting operation or an elaborate administrative ruse. Any deviation from his standard routine might tip him off. Instead, they opted for raw, blunt law enforcement action. On the morning of February 21st, 1994, a federal holiday, Ames stepped out of his Arlington home and climbed into his Jaguar. He was planning to drive to the headquarters of the Central Intelligence Agency to complete some administrative paperwork before his scheduled flight. He made it less than 2 blocks. Unmarked sedans suddenly converged on the intersection, executing a flawless rolling block that trapped the Jaguar against the curb. Agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation rapidly approached the vehicle, opened the door, and placed the senior Soviet branch chief under arrest. Ames did not react with the stoic discipline of a master spy, nor did he offer a complex ideological defense. His initial response was pure, arrogant entitlement. He looked at the arresting agents and simply stated that they were making a massive mistake. He genuinely believed that his bureaucratic status and his decades of internal navigation would somehow protect him from a street-level arrest. But that arrogance evaporated the moment he was placed in an interrogation room and presented with the evidence. The investigators did not just confront him with broad accusations of espionage. They methodically slid photographs of his chalk marks on the Washington mailboxes across the table. They produced the meticulously reconstructed digital ledgers recovered from the unallocated sectors of his personal hard drive. They presented the routing numbers for the clandestine accounts at Credit Suisse, detailing millions of dollars in Russian deposits. Ames immediately recognized that his internal smokescreen had completely dissipated. Faced with an airtight matrix of physical, digital, and financial evidence, he chose self-preservation, quickly agreeing to a plea deal to mitigate the legal exposure of his wife, who had actively assisted in concealing the massive influx of illicit currency. The physical arrest of Aldrich Ames neatly resolved the immediate counterintelligence crisis, but the bureaucratic shockwave it unleashed completely shattered the foundational culture of the Central Intelligence Agency. For 9 years, the elite leadership at Langley had forcefully maintained that their catastrophic operational losses in the Soviet Union were the result of a brilliant, highly sophisticated technical breach. He defeated it by simply walking through massive, gaping holes in the agency's own bureaucratic architecture. Consider the fundamental failure of the polygraph system. For decades, the intelligence community had heavily relied on the polygraph as the ultimate internal security tripwire, granting the machine an almost mythical status in the clearance process. But the congressional postmortem highlighted a devastating operational reality. The polygraph does not detect deception. It strictly measures physiological arousal and baseline stress indicators. Because Ames possessed absolutely no moral compass regarding his treason, and because his profound arrogance insulated him from any feelings of guilt or anxiety, his physiological baseline never spiked. Furthermore, the examiners administering the tests lacked the necessary operational context to challenge him. When the machine registered minor anomalies regarding his contact with foreign nationals, Ames simply pointed to his official job description, which required him to assess Soviet diplomats for recruitment. The examiners, operating in a heavily stovepiped security division, completely divorced from the operational realities of the Soviet desk, accepted his excuses as administrative routine. The polygraph had devolved from a rigorous investigative tool into a procedural rubber stamp, lulling the institution into a deeply false sense of security. This severe compartmentalization was the structural engine that allowed Ames to operate with absolute impunity. The Office of Security and the operational divisions were entirely isolated fiefdoms. When colleagues casually noticed Ames driving a $50,000 vehicle on a mid-level government salary or paying for a $500,000 home entirely in cash, those observations were rarely formalized. When they were reported, the Office of Security failed to establish a criminal predicate to audit his finances, heavily citing the constraints of the Privacy Act. But beneath the legal excuses lay a much darker, strictly cultural vulnerability. The Central Intelligence Agency in the 1980s operated as an elite, deeply insular fraternity. The prevailing assumption among the senior executive leadership was that foreign intelligence officers might defect, but an American branch chief simply did not sell out his own colleagues to the Committee for State Security. This elitist bias was so thoroughly ingrained that when confronted with the undeniable disintegration of their Soviet networks, the agency's directors aggressively externalized the blame. They eagerly embraced the KGB deception campaigns. They chased the rumors of spy dust and fabricated technical breaches because those explanations validated their existing worldview. To admit that one of their own was walking highly classified personnel directories out the front door in plastic shopping bags was to admit that their entire institutional culture was fundamentally flawed. The fallout from these revelations triggered the most sweeping counterintelligence reforms in the history of the American intelligence apparatus. The legislative response aggressively mandated the tearing down of the jurisdictional walls that had paralyzed the Ames investigation. Financial auditing, once considered an invasive breach of professional courtesy, was permanently integrated into the security clearance process. Intelligence personnel with access to highly sensitive compartments were suddenly required to submit comprehensive financial disclosure forms, allowing investigators to rigorously track their real estate purchases, credit card debt, and foreign banking activities. The fundamental philosophy of internal security shifted from periodic, localized checks to a doctrine of continuous evaluation. The government recognized that a security clearance granted in 1980 could not blindly remain valid a decade later without constant, invasive reassessment of the employee's financial and psychological stability. But as historians and current intelligence professionals evaluate the long-term legacy of the Ames Compromise, a highly complex debate remains unresolved. Today, The internal surveillance architecture within the defense and intelligence communities is heavily automated. Personnel are subjected to continuous digital monitoring, where algorithms automatically aggregate credit reports, travel manifests, and digital communications, constantly searching for the exact type of financial anomalies that Ames generated so openly. The critical question is whether this massive influx of digital surveillance has actually cured the underlying bureaucratic blindness, or merely masked it under an avalanche of data. When an algorithm flags thousands of minor financial anomalies across a sprawling federal workforce, the system inevitably generates operational fatigue. Investigators must still manually determine which red flag represents a simple administrative oversight and which one represents an active compromise. Furthermore, no algorithmic threat matrix can completely eliminate the human element of bias. If a highly respected senior executive triggers a security anomaly today, does the institution aggressively investigate them, or does the modern equivalent of the old boys club simply dismiss the alert as an algorithm working out of context? The intelligence community is permanently caught in an operational paradox. To successfully recruit foreign assets and execute global operations, an agency must inherently trust its own highly trained personnel. But to survive the relentless, silent war of counterespionage, it is mandated to constantly suspect them. Aldrich Ames exploited that precise paradox to trade American strategic dominance for a life of temporary, unearned luxury. He systematically dismantled decades of painstaking operational engineering, leading directly to the neutralization and fatal outcomes of the very men who had trusted the United States to protect them. Today, he remains in a federal penitentiary, serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. But the structural ghosts of his betrayal still haunt the corridors of American intelligence, serving as a permanent, chilling reminder that the greatest threat to a fortified system rarely comes from a brilliant external attack. It almost always comes from an unremarkable man sitting quietly inside the vault.